Hi, good morning. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about the politics and the security situation in West Africa. We're going to focus on three countries, Ivory Coast, Senegal, and a bit of Mali. And welcome both of you who will help me figure out what is happening and what is the situation in West Africa, especially following the coup d'etat in Mali and also the elections in Ivory Coast, who has had already two civil wars. And it looks like what is happening is not going much better this time either. So Pauline, I will start with you. Can you let us know a bit of the background on the wars in Ivory Coast, and why is it what is happening now with the outcome of the elections and how the elections panned out in general aren't as positive as we had hoped for?
Thank you, Carmeliza. So the civil wars in Ivory Coast, as you said, there were two, although some consider it just one, because it's an extension of the same crisis. And so in 2002, rebels, mostly based in the north of Ivory Coast and also on the other side of the border in Burkina Faso, attacked military posts, first in the north and central parts of the country, and then were joined by militias who were based more to the west of the country, with the border with Liberia. And this civil war lasted for until more or less 2007, and the first peaceful elections to be organized after that were the elections in 2010. Which we now remember as the elections that opposed Laurent Gbagbo to Alassane Ouattara, Laurent Gbagbo being the incumbent and Alassane Ouattara being supported by the rebels during the civil war as well, and mostly. And at the time, Alassane Ouattara won after a crisis that erupted because Laurent Gbagbo wanted to claim the victory. And so Alassane Ouattara in the end won with the support of, among others, the UN and the international community, who were pressurizing Laurent Gbagbo in accepting defeat. And this didn't happen without a lot of violence. And it took quite some time until it settled down. And these elections this year are very similar to what happened in 2010, in the sense that this time it's Alassane Ouattara who was running for a third term against against the same political parties from those elections. And his candidacy was very disputed because the constitution says that you cannot run for more than 2 terms, which Alassane Ouattara has already completed. But he had announced for many years that he wouldn't run anyway for the third term. But his chosen candidate died in July, unexpectedly. And so in August, Ouattara announced his candidacy because there was no one else to run in his place. And that's how we came up to August, where the Constitutional Court accepted Ouattara's candidacy and refused 40 candidates who were denied the right to run, including former President Laurent Gbagbo and former Prime Minister Guillaume Soro, who are the two we hear a lot about right now, as well. And allowed to run were 3 main candidates, so Ouattara on one side, Henri Konan Bédié, who is a former president of Côte d'Ivoire, who was a president between 93 and 99. And then a third candidate from the party of Laurent Gbagbo. And I forgot to mention there is a fourth candidate who is more of an independent. So these are the four who were allowed to run. But because Ouattara was allowed to run, the opposition candidates, so the Laurent Gbagbo's party, as well as Henri Konan-Bédier, have boycotted the elections, refusing to run, saying that it's unconstitutional. And that's how we ended up with the election results. So the election was on 31st of October. And the results were proclaimed by the Constitutional Court on the 4th of November. Or, no, very recently, Monday or this weekend, confirming that Ouattara has won and saying that even though the elections was boycotted, and by boycotted it means that armed men blocked access to some of the polling stations. So the boycott wasn't just people sat at home and refused to go voting. The boycott means that the elections couldn't be run smoothly, and it is estimated
so you mean boycotted? Who were these armed men? Were these from the opposition? Because usually boycott means that you don't want to go or you refuse to go.
So it's exactly. So it's very difficult to identify who is who in those situations. But yeah, it's not the army who closed access to the polling station. It's rebel group, militias, youth groups who blocked access to some polling stations, meaning that out of the 7 million voters, at least 1 million, maybe more, couldn't vote because the polling stations never opened.
Okay.
And that's how we end up with that result of 94% of the votes to Alassane Ouattara.
Well, so in my country, Mozambique, we have received memes about this on Gbagbo having 100%, and it was laughable. We don't have a perfect democracy either, but even to our standards, that was more than laughable. But so in a sense, this boycott ended up helping Ouattara.
Well, of course, if you don't vote against him, you don't express a vote, he gets more support. But the other aspect is the calculation that has been made and how the commission came up to these 94% of votes. So it's 94% of the expressed votes. Mm-hmm. And the participation is 53%, more or less, 53.9%, mm-hmm. of the ones, if you account only for the electors that were allowed to go voting, so the ones that are registered at those polling stations that were open. So this is,
shady, to say the least. Well, yes, tell me.
Yeah, it's shady, but it's not new. The exact same situation happened in 1995. In an elections where Henri Konan-Bédier, one of the current opposition candidates, was elected, and Alassane Ouattara was excluded from the votes based on this Ivoirité concept. So based on the fact that he's not Ivorians from both of his parents.
Okay.
But
that has gone now.
Yes.
From what you're saying, it played very differently in Senegal on the elections, that the youth came out and did not allow the incumbent to run because he was too old. He had been there for a long time. Vegard, do you want to comment a bit about that? It seems like Senegal keeps on trying to be the different or the odd man out here in the region.
Yes, thank you. I think that's quite correct. I'm assuming you mean the 2012 election now. Yes. So just on your last comment there, Senegal does stand out a little bit in the region. It's one of the only countries that has not experienced a coup d'etat, or at least a successful coup d'etat. There have been several attempts. Senghor survived a few of them. While quite autocratic for a very long period of time, it was one of the first countries to start a democratization process, basically in the 1980s, opening up for opposition parties to start running in elections. And they have never had military government. The military has always been under civil control. So compared to the rest of the region, that does stand out a little bit. What they have had, which is quite common with the rest of the region, and I'm looking at you now, Pauline, it does sound a bit like Côte d'Ivoire, is contested elections, right? So you had that in 2000 when Abdou Diouf, the long-term socialist president, ran for the, I don't know how many times he had run before, but he had been in power for 20 years. And he was ousted by Abdoulaye Wade, and then who ran again successfully in 2007, and then wanted to run again in 2012, which according to the constitution he could not do. So the constitution prohibits two-term, or as it does in Côte d'Ivoire, you can't run for a third term. But their argument was the same, basically, that since there had been a new constitution, it had been set back, the first term shouldn't count, which is a strange argument, I would say, but it's something that is very common in the region. I hope we can get back to that this is sort of a trend we see everywhere. And then really the youth came out. First, in 2011, he tried to amend the constitution, which would make it much easier for him to run. He tried to introduce a vice president, which was supposed to be his son, conveniently enough. And then, but this was opposed by civil society, by hip hop groups, and several others who were in the streets for months, basically. And in the end, so there was a runoff. There was no boycott this time, and there was a runoff election, or a second deuxième tour, basically, where because no one got more than 50% in the first round, so it had to go to a second round. And there, Abdoulaye Wade lost to Macky Sall. And this was hailed all over the world as a massive victory for African democracy, West African democracy amid burgeoning crisis in Mali. This was sort of a very good sign for African democracy. But I think that as time has moved on, as time has passed by, I think we see that Macky Sall is not a super Democrat either. We're seeing rumors that he is planning to run a third term himself, or at least he doesn't want to preclude it. And several of his advisors have said that if you look at the constitution and the law, then he will be allowed to run. And the argument is basically exactly the same as Abdoulaye Wade made. So, and he knows that he can trust the constitutional court because he's named them all. So this idea of judicial independence is non-existent. So he will have the judicial backing if he so chooses. Whether the street and civil society will allow it, I'm not so sure. Yeah.
But is this a deterioration of a situation, of a democratic situation in Senegal in the last years, or is it just that the conditions before were not there for what he's doing now?
I definitely think you can call it a deterioration. You've had, at least symbolically, there was so much support for him when he came into power. But this was the same in Abdoulaye Wade in 2000. This was also hailed as the grande alternance, of finally an incumbent loses and accepts to lose. I think that's crucial, and we see nowadays that's not always the case, even in Western democracies. So accepting to lose is crucial, and Macky Sall has been quite he's pushed a very transformative agenda, the Plan Senegal Emergent, which is supposed to bring Senegal up to another level of development in just 10 years. So it's very, very ambitious, and I think people had very high hopes. But right now, I think those hopes are increased, and this is also linked to the fact that several opposition parties, opposition candidates they haven't been allowed to run, like in Côte d'Ivoire. So Karim Wade, Abdoulaye Wade's son, was not allowed to run because he was indicted for corruption, rightly so, I must add, because he was very corrupt. And then you have a very prominent socialist who was precluded from running in 2019, Khalifa Sall, because he was the mayor of Dakar and he used political funds there to basically for corrupt reasons. And so it was basically, he was most likely corrupt, but the problem is that everyone else has also been corrupt, but they chose to focus on Khalifa Sall. So I think that's selective use of the law is very much a feature in Senegalese democracy, or Senegalese politics, sorry.
Well, I want to go a little bit into the security situation, and I'll come back to you, Vegard, again on the exceptionalism of Senegal, or apparent exceptionalism of Senegal. But maybe picking up a bit on Mali, Stig, you could maybe talk a little bit. I'm not sure how Mali's situation in the north is completely excluded from what is happening in the region. I know that there are different kinds of insurgencies in the whole of West Africa, but I wonder if you have a comment on how connected are these?
What we've seen notably over the last 2 years is that maybe it's increased connectedness. So what we saw in Mali, in the border areas with Niger, is the Islamic State of Greater Sahara. And the Islamic State of Greater Sahara, after its inception, was rather lying low. It was a weak organization initially. It started out with a lot of Sarawit refugees. It started out as a kind of offshot of scene with Al-Sarawi maybe being like an outsider who had some kind of hostility towards the central Al-Qaeda leadership in Algeria. Then I'm talking about Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. So it's the Islamic State in Greater Sahara was actually quite weak at the start. And quite pressured by some of the Al-Qaeda affiliates, including Ansar Din, inside Mali. What we saw is relatively notable. We've seen that the Islamic State in Greater Sahara has been closed down, so it's been shut down, and it's now formally integrated in the Islamic State in Western Africa. So it has been basically put under the theoretical command of Barnawi and one of the split fractions of the Boko Haram. And what's interesting for me is that at the same time, we see an increase in the activity of the Islamic State in who's now named in Western Sahara, in the border areas between Niger and Mali. So the question is, why do we see this surge in activity over the last 2 years? And we don't fully know. We have to explore it. But one possible hypothesis is some kind of competence and money transfer from somewhere. That's a possibility. But we see that this organization now, it's much more established. Other than that, you have JNIM, and JNIM is locally focused, and even the Islamic State to a certain extent do try to embed themselves in local tribal conflicts. So you can actually see a local embeddedness combined with this foreign influence when it comes to the Islamic State. While then Jainim is in an interesting situation, because Ansar Din is, of course, the older, strong part of Jainim, and it's very closely Tuareg based. It has a local anchorage, and many Malians would see Iyad Agali as a pragmatist, the leader of Ansar Din and the leader of Jainim, who is a union of 4 organizations, which basically of which Ansar Din was the largest. But another member in this umbrella, Jainim, is the southern part of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. So it's also a subgroup that basically have a long history in the region. It was in the early 2000s, it was sent southwards because it was easier to operate in the south. It embedded itself in the local community in the northern Mali, but also in Libya, in the border areas with Libya, and gained a lot of local contacts. So it was to a certain extent localized. But the paradox of this part of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb is basically that the northern part of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb is kind of defeated locally. So in one sense, it's not the center of gravity of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. That's the subunit of the Jainim. It's rather complicated, but it's an interesting situation. The question is what it means with regards to a central leadership of Al-Qaeda. Maybe it doesn't mean anything, in fact, because Al-Qaeda is rather localized. It is rather fragmented as it is. It seems to me that if you talk about transnational dynamics, if you talk about wider reach, it's much more interesting to look into the Islamic State in the region. And it's an interesting development when you see those, that increase of the attack frequency in the border areas between Niger and Mali. And of course, Niger is rather pressured in all of this because we expected Boko Haram to be defeated in the Borno province, but Boko Haram is still there. No, the northern part of Boko Haram, as I said, it's rebranded itself Islamic State in Western Africa. It's still putting pressure on Niger. So what you see, it's a double pressure on Niger. It's a pressure on Niger in the west, and it's a pressure on Niger in the southeast as well. And the question is if Niger can handle this. And of course, things haven't been fully settled down inside Mali either. What we see inside Mali is increasing skepticism to the forever war of France. I will use that name because I think it's crucial when we talk about the military coup this autumn to understand what's going on inside Niger and Mali when it comes to the role of France. A lot of local leaders will see France as basically not being able to defeat the insurgency and being able to maintain security, and thus being increasingly skeptical to the French effort, to the extent that you can see conspiracy theories within Niger and Mali as well, suggesting that France is behind this forever war, that it's a kind of means to control the two countries, to control the old colonial legacy. This is, of course, kind of just conspiracy theory, but sometimes conspiracy theory takes a life of its own. And I think this conspiracy theory is also crucial in explaining the military coup, that you have a security situation that hasn't been improved over many, many years. And the local population, both in Niger and Mali, are quite dissatisfied with that. And that leads to reactions at the local level. But to make my argument short and concise, I might say that if you want to look at trans-border dynamics, to me, it's much more interesting to look into the Islamic State of Western Africa than it is to look into the Al-Qaeda affiliates. And I think Jainim draws much more on local impulses than perhaps the Islamic State of West Africa.
Thank you, Stig. Actually, you kind of took the question that I was going to ask afterwards, which is the role of France. And I was wondering, just in general, not just in Mali, in relation to the coup d'etat now, but just in general, if any one of you wants to to comment further on the role of France in terms of security. Clearly, as Stig says, it hasn't been going well. The violence has not decreased. It hasn't been resolved. I wonder, Stig, how has it been possible that these offshoots of Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb have been defeated, but not in Western Africa? I don't know if you have an answer for that, but
yes, I have quite strong opinions on that, in fact. And the first thing is I attended a seminar at the AFRICOM in close to Venice in December this year. Not December, sorry, February it must have been, just before the lockdown. And the Americans have actually delegated all the security responsibility, and they say it broadly themselves that in West Africa, they don't care that much. So they're stepping down. Also worked with the European Commission, and the European Commission is also interesting when it comes to Sahel, because it seems like they delegated everything to France as well. So if you go into the Commission and if you work with Commission members dealing with the Saharan countries in the West, then basically France have more positions than the rest, and it seems like Germany and Italy and Spain doesn't care that much, and as you know, United Kingdom is on the way out. So in one sense, this France has been left alone by the Western powers in those countries. And France is to a certain extent following Western doctrine, so it's more interested in defeating this insurgency kinetically in big battles, rather than to secure the countryside and protect local civilians. And that gives some kind of perverse dynamics, because it becomes very easy for these organizations to embed themselves locally, because nobody protects them, the locals, and it becomes very easily for them to pressure the locals as well. So you have a strange dynamics where France and their counterinsurgency efforts has main focus on two issues. The first is to defeat JNIM and the Islamic State in open battle. The second is to protect themselves. And these two issues are there. And that ensures that the JNIM and as well as the Islamic State, they have quite free reins in the countryside. So they can do whatever they will with the local population if the local populations don't protect themselves. And I think this is a recipe for a forever war. So I know Marc-Antoine de Perlois de Monteclos, he talked about this in Le Monde. So he said France is engaged in a forever war in Mali and Niger. And I think he's right. France is engaged in a forever war because there are no strategical direction. There are no strategical plan to secure the countryside. And of course, this creates conspiracy theories. So I think there's actually a big doctrinal problem with France and their French engagement locally. And unfortunately for us, they've been kind of left alone in doing these games. So I think what we saw now in the military coup is kind of a top of the iceberg. I think more is coming. You know, France is creating a lot of local animosities. And the end of this will, I think, I'm very happy that Norway didn't engage itself in Mali, because I think the end of this will be a kind of a big setback for France and the French standing in the region. This is not going to end with the French military victory against JNIM. That's for sure. It's going to drag on and drag on and drag on forever. That's my expectations, at least.
But there is one other actor, not just France, which is ECOWAS. And I wanted to ask again, the three of you, what are your opinions on ECOWAS' role? Because as I understand it, it hasn't been equally strong, and it really depends on who's who, the way they engage. And they also have, as far as I understand, also this kind of attitude that is not necessarily protecting the communities. So what does this actor do to stabilizing, or maybe not stabilizing that much, the region?
Yeah. I can start out, but I would welcome also comments from the panel. I think ECOWAS is in a strange position, because you see Nigeria kind of failing inside their own country. And as you say, Nigeria follows the example of France when it comes to doctrine. You know, this might actually be a big doctrinal problem, also because Nigeria is trained by Western military instructors. So Nigerian army has seen several really bad problems in 2016 in the Borno province. So they all, you know, they were defeated, and humiliatingly enough for Nigeria, it's possible to make the argument that it was Chad who saved the situation, with a big cost for Chad, I might add, because it kind of regionalized the Boko Haram. So now Boko Haram is to a larger extent hitting at Chad as well as Nigeria. And as you said, you know, Nigeria is going in the wrong direction. Also military-wise, they have this principle of super camps. They want to organize themselves in order to protect their forces and abandon more or less the countryside. So Nigeria has proved itself to be quite weak, and then you have to have some kind of lead. And what we see now is, I wonder what the other panelists think, but it's a kind of Chad stepping up, and some of the other countries that could have been there, they don't seem to be that interested, like Ghana, for example. And the question is if Chad can sustain its efforts, and it's kind of costly for Chad as well.
Pauline, Vegard?
I'm not too sure about the role of Chad, because that's not really an area I've focused on so much. But I agree with Stig's analysis of how France has been reacting its military doctrine in Mali and in the region more generally. And it's these issues and how to say. So on one hand, these are not really new issues. Ivory Coast has a lot of, there is a lot of tensions around the French presence in Ivory Coast, and there has been for very many years. And they are not just related to recent developments in terms of security situation in Mali, in the greater West African region. On one hand. On another hand, to go back to the ECOWAS aspect, when we prepared for this panel, we were discussing about how ECOWAS seemed to have taken more of a lead in managing the Mali coup, or in negotiating and adding as a mediator during the coup in Mali this summer, whereas in Ivory Coast, they've taken more of a hands-off approach, calling for peaceful elections, calling for negotiations, asking the president of Ivory Coast to instigate the candidates that were excluded. But just yesterday, ECOWAS finally congratulated Alassane Ouattara on his victory, calling for reintegration and reconciliation and peace, but nothing very much there. So, as you said, as we were saying when preparing for the panel, ECOWAS seems to have this very, how to say, they don't take strong positions in a lot of cases. And Mali was maybe like the political negotiations around the coup in Mali were maybe more of an easy field of engagement, as opposed to, for example, discussing politics in Ivory Coast or going more into military battle against Islamist forces.
Vegard.
Yeah, thank you. First, to the question of France, I think I agree with Stig that they're in a very difficult position, and I think their position goes or wider than just security, obviously, although the two are linked. But in Senegal, but in many other of the West African countries, we see that, especially on economic issues, there's a very big sort of hate towards France for the CFA, the West African money, and there have been numerous demonstrations and calls for leaving the CFA, and because they feel that it's bad for the economics, and it's for the economic growth and the economic structure of these countries. And it's basically benefiting France. And it added on top of this, especially in Senegal right now, you have massive demonstrations against the caricatures that have come up again in France during the last terror attacks. And so you have thousands of people in the streets calling for Macron to well, to get out of Senegal, etc. So you have this, you have several different themes that go against France at the same time, basically, and that is especially problematic for Macky Sall, the president of Senegal, who is, I mean, his plan to get Senegal up is this emergent Senegal plan. It really relies on foreign investments and foreign aid. So this is a huge problem for him. On to the ECOWAS question. I think that's very interesting, and I think you see the I wouldn't call it hypocrisy, but I mean, choosing their battles very, very carefully. You see that, for example, with regards to the Gambia in 2016, 2017, where they were all too happy to go into the Gambia, and with a massive force, mainly of Senegalese troops, but also Nigerians and others, and they've stayed there. They're still there. They're going to be there till 2021. There might be good military reasons for that, but there's also political reasons why, for example, Senegal is pushing or was very happy to push for an intervention in the Gambia, because the former dictator was a pain for Macky Sall, because of regional conflicts in the south of Senegal, etc. So I think ECOWAS is also prone to this, the realpolitik, and the fact that it's much easier to go against a weaker country than a big country like Nigeria. They haven't said anything about the police violence going on right now, etc. So it's I think that's part of the thing here.
Has ECOWAS weakened from before? Because I think at least in the 90s, early 2000s, ECOWAS was extremely present and deploying quite often, whereas now it is more of a I wouldn't say an invisible force, but and not silence, certainly for the people where they intervene, but it's not appearing as much as it used to be, at least in the media and their actions. It's something that has been restrained to the region, and knowledge is retained in the region and not worldwide. Is this, for example, a disinterest of the media, or is it a change in how operations are conducted, more visibility of fronts, more national or apparent national politics? What is going on there? Not
I'm not an expert on ECOWAS, so I don't know. But I think, I mean, part of it is linked to the fact that, but this has been going on for a long time, that the prevalent paradigm has been what goes on inside the country stays within the country in a way, you know, like you don't want to interfere in other countries in Africa. And I think that's part of the reason, you know, the chairpersons of the ECOWAS are the different, like, so it rotates, right, from country to country. Right now it's the president of Ghana, and so I think that's also a reason to that they're careful criticizing, because they know that they can be criticized themselves. You better stay silent unless you want to be criticized yourself. So I think that might be one of the reasons.
We see a similar pattern in Southern Africa and Eastern Africa. I want to ask our participants if they have any questions. They can either ask it in the chat so that I can post to our panelists. And I would sort of ask now, what is your opinion, Stig? What does this coup, which has used which has used the same rhetoric or a similar rhetoric in regards to the reason why it happened, which is the violence, and the mishandling of the management of the violence in the north. What will this coup accomplish, or is it just an exercise on frustration and nothing else?
It's a hard question, and one of the reasons, I think there's several issues here. You know, one of the issues is that the French security strategy, as I said earlier, probably is not sustainable. And the potential of the coup is maybe to reinvigorate some kind of dialogue with the Ansar Din component of Janim and Iyad Agali. But the question is if Iyad Agali actually is as approachable as a lot of the Malian parliamentarians seem to think. He's very often seen as some kind of pragmatist in Bamako, but it might be that he's changed over the years. But it's worth a try. At least it's a kind of better approach than the pure military approach that France is following in the north. And maybe there's a hope that you have some kind of fresh approach to handling local conflicts as well, especially in the Mopti region. But still, the Malian state is so weak, so I don't really see the capacity there. And the problem is that you can get the habit of military coups over and over again. So I'm rather skeptical to the effects of the military coup. I think things, unfortunately for the world, and it will stay pretty much the same. But if there's any positive effect, it might be that a non-negotiation line is kind of challenged by the Malians themselves, and that you can have an attempt to deal with Janim. And you can see that Janim has actually been relatively flexible in some of their propaganda. You know, they talk about getting out the foreigners, that means France, rather than to evicting a government in Bamako in some of their propaganda videos. So it's worth a try, but I don't think it will work, but it's a potential positive effect. I think that things will be a little messy as it is today in the future.
Well, Vegard, Pauline, do you have an opinion about the African Union does not condone coups, but it hasn't been very forceful with this coup in Mali this time.
No, I think they've left it to be handled by ECOWAS, actually.
Yes, which is strange. Usually they are quite forceful. They were a bit more forceful with Egypt. They were a bit more forceful with Burundi, halfway, but very, very silent on Mali this time.
Mm-hmm.
They were the first time, but very, very silent. And this policy of not meddling in, for not wanting to be criticized, is there, but they usually announce that they do not like, and they have suspended members before for having coup d'etats. Again, I pose the same question: is it expected that something can be accomplished with the new government, even, or is that Stig says, it will continue and there will be a new coup d'etat because there is no easy solution for what is happening?
Well, in a sense, it's still a very fresh coup. And so we also have to wait and see a bit how the strategies of negotiation will work and pan out before we can say something. I would be hopeful that they actually manage something, because at least it's interesting to see that the mediation was done more at the regional level than with the usual meddling of France. So I'm really hoping for something a bit different this time. But maybe that's my enthusiasm more than an optimism more than anything.
I want to go back to Senegal's exceptionalism, and sort of we're looking at, as Stig said, a weakness from the side of Mali's state, meddling, etc. We have this more consolidation of these terror networks that are becoming stronger and more and with a stronger presence in different countries, not just focusing on smaller conflicts, but making it strong. How has Senegal been able to avoid this? I know you have said before, we have talked about this, that there is talk about it, of the potential for this spilling over to Senegal. What is the likelihood, Vegard?
I'm not sure I should give a likelihood or probability of this happening in Senegal, but it's definitely an ongoing public discussion. And when I was doing my fieldwork there in 2017, 2018, it was basically during the legislative elections in 2017. That was one of the topics that was very highly discussed, and it was more a question of when rather than if you would have terrorist attacks. But it was, I don't think they do fear, and they look at Mali and fear what is going on there. They look at Burkina Faso and they fear what's going on there. There's a lot of fear. I don't think what is happening in Mali is likely at all in Senegal, because it's a very different country. It's as I said, much more politically stable for many reasons. And then they have these Muslim brotherhoods that have been traditionally very, very important. These traditionally Sufi Muslim brotherhoods, which almost all Senegalese citizens have a relationship with and sort of trust in a very large degree. They have close relationships between sort of the masters, or the sheikhs, and the disciples. And the sheikhs are used as spiritual, but also guidance for all things in life, basically. And they've been very, very against any move towards a more radical Islam. Obviously they're very different from the Salafists or the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda and all that, because they've themselves been targeted. Not necessarily in Senegal, but in other countries, the Sufi brotherhoods have been targeted. So there's that, and then also the brotherhoods are very interested in political stability. So they actually form part of a Senegalese social contract where sort of the state helps the brotherhoods, and the brotherhoods help the state. And by helping the state, I mean they sort of mediate social conflicts, political conflicts, violent conflicts. So there's just less conflict to be used. So you can't use conflict to the same extent as you can in the other countries to incentivize terrorism. And you don't have the regional element to the same extent. You do have regional conflict in the south of Senegal. So basically between the Gambia and Guinea Bissau, you have a small portion of Senegalese land, which is currently contested. There's a ceasefire, but these are it's in the periphery of the country, and this hasn't engendered any type of terrorism. These are it's a Christian minority there. But I do think this Muslim Brotherhood has really quenched the potential for terrorism, but this is changing. So basically, since the 1980s, you've had a gradual opening up of the religious spectrum in Senegal. You have now many more smaller so-called marabouts, so religious leaders, who are trying to find their place in a very hectic religious landscape. You have Senegalese who've been studying abroad in Egypt and in Qatar and elsewhere, who come back home, start with what's called foreign ideas, and start their own Islamic schools. There have also been recently in 2018, there was a huge legal process against a series of terrorists in Senegal. So they're present, but for now, the Senegalese state has been able to sort of prosecute anyone who's been where they see that they've planned terrorist attacks, but who knows what's going to happen in the future. I think it's likely, but I think they will respond in a I hope they will respond in a good way if it so happens, and that it doesn't sort of destabilize the state in the same way as it has done in many other countries. And I don't think that's likely, because the state is much stronger. The military is much more loyal to the civilian government than in many other countries, like in Cote d'Ivoire or Mali.
So we have a question from the panelists. Thank you, Tomin. The question is, do you think Senegal will be able to be more independent from France? What are the challenges? I think this is for you, Vegard.
Thank you. That's a good question. I think many people want them to be more independent. And I think that's what Abdoulaye Wade, to a certain extent, tried. He based his legitimacy more on, what he did, he tried to make closer ties with one particular Islamic Muslim Brotherhood, the Murids, and in doing so, he was also closer to some Middle Eastern countries. Whereas Macky Sall has rather gone the other way again. He's much more closely tied to France, I feel, and he has struck up a good partnership with Macron. They seem to be to have a good relationship. And as I mentioned, the whole economic project of Macky Sall relies on foreign investment in infrastructure, in agriculture as well. So they need foreign investment, but they're also interesting for the Americans, right? So the US sees Senegal as sort of a small island of peace in a very hectic region. So that is one venue. I don't know if switching dependence on France to dependence on the US is a good strategy, but I think there is movement to try to become more independent economically, at least, with these movements to get out of the CFA. And I think it remains to be seen how successful it will be, and I don't think only Senegal can do that, because it's a regional currency, so they probably would have to get the other countries with them. But I think there are efforts to try to get independent, but it's really, really hard, right? It's
yeah, so what you said kind of contradicts what was said before about the US not being interested. Well, I'm not sure how interested they are in the region, but as you say, they have some interest in Senegal. Well, maybe not military, but economic. So I actually wanted to understand a little bit better how can Senegal be strong and not, for example, the Ivory Coast is actually, it is an economic power, at least it was a strong economic power in the region, and I would assume that meant also that it was a relatively strong state. So Mali is also not a small force. So how have these states weakened, and what are exactly the elements that they have that allow for terrorism to happen in one hand, or grievances to fester and then become these strong violent outbursts, to say. Yeah. Yes, Stig, I think you want to comment.
Yeah. I think let me comment on Mali because I know Mali the best, and I think Mali has there are some weaknesses in Mali, and the first is that the north is simply very hard to control. You need to draw upon consensus in able to if you are want to govern it, because it's large distances. And in addition to that, Mali had the misfortune of being placed where it is, basically close to Libya, and that's still an element, and which we should not forget when we talk about JNIM. You know, part of JNIM is actually the Al-Qaeda part of JNIM. It's actually drifting towards Libya, so it's a transporter mechanism in relation to Libya, and it's easily forgotten. And so in the north you have a relatively low tax income and a relatively vast distances. And I might add also that you have this colonial tradition where you have security services existing to manage state security and not human security, not providing services for the people. And I think that's one of the things that has been neglected in order to solve the jihadi issues in the central regions. And in the north, you need to solve a lot of local conflicts. And I mean really local conflicts, you know, not only this big rivalry between the platform and CMF, but also local conflicts at a more local level. So you have to be able to provide security to the ordinary Malians, and given the tax income, given the sizes of the distance in the north, that's actually a rather hard task. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but it will take time, and you need different approaches to actually manage it. And unfortunately for Mali, they can never get rid of the border with Libya. So a lot of Mali issues in Mali is actually dependent on reaching some kind of solution inside Libya as well. Yeah.
Pauline?
Yeah, if you want to turn to Ivory Coast, whom, as you said, was and is a very strong economy in the region and still is in many aspects. What is really interesting with Ivory Coast and the way it's developed now with the elections, for example, is that the economic growth after independence has been a lot supported by migration, both within the country and from outside in the region more generally. And this is a bit at the root, or often analyzed as one of the roots of the issues with the elections, is that you have these populations that moved around in the country. So the people from the north, usually more from different ethnic groups and usually more Muslims, have been moving around a lot more towards the south, on the west, and the center of the country for agriculture, to develop the agriculture. You had a lot of freedom to do that, with the recognition of property that was a bit disputable and is at the origin of a lot of the grievances among who is the owner of the land. Is it the person who developed it, or is it the persons who were there before? You have a lot of those dynamics that have been in many aspects at the roots of the political violence we now see in Ivory Coast since the death of Houphouët-Boigny in 93, I think. So since that time, you've had the development of that concept of ivoirité, which is what does it mean to be from Côte d'Ivoire, and is related to citizenship. And it was developed by one of today's opposition, Henri Conan-Bédier, who was at the time interim president and then became president. And he developed that concept to exclude from the elections the current president of Ivory Coast. So you see, the whole politics of Ivory Coast brings you back to the 90s. All of those leaders are now very old. They are the same, and they changed alliances based on elections. But the grievances and the question comes back to these issues of movements within the country and from outside the country, and how to integrate.
So I have one question, and it's been very interesting and very illuminating in many ways. But I have one last question from young Magna, who asks Stig if your background is linked in some way to West Africa. I was curious about it.
I'm approaching West Africa from East Africa, no doubt about it, and a little bit from the north also. So I did a lot of field studies, more in Nigeria than in Mali, but I'm kind of coming at this from an East African perspective, I have to admit.
No, he meant the picture you have in the back, your background picture.
That's from one of my field studies in actually Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem.
Yeah.
I would like to thank you all. I think we don't have time for any more discussions, although I have still some lingering questions, but we can continue at another venue. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you so much for your comments and for clarifying certain issues, although I still feel there is a lot of muddle, namely, you know, how is a right solution of handling terrorist crisis when it comes to Senegal? What will it mean to do it the right way? Because so far I don't think anyone has managed to do it in a good way, if there is any. So thank you, and thank you for the panel participants who have been here with us today.